Today I'm with Dr. Cam Murray. He's an economist specialising in property, urban development, environmental economics, rent-seeking and corruption. I've been following Cam for a while on Twitter and have enjoyed his Substack and podcast called Fresh Economic Thinking. As a layperson who doesn't know that much about economics, I've been interested in how Cam compares Australia's property market with other countries, helping me understand why, frankly, our market is so messed up and difficult for people my age. I also really loved his book, Game of Mates, How Favours Bleed the Nation, which tells the tale of economic theft across major sectors of Australia's economy, showing how well-connected politicians siphon off billions to line their own pockets. It also explains how much this costs the average Aussie and what we can do about it. So Cam, Game of Mates was published 6 years ago. Is Australia still as economically corrupt as it was then?
Funny you mention that. Since the book came out, people have asked me and sent me a lot of examples and said, you've got to update the book. So actually last year we did update the book and it's been re-released. It's now called Rigged, How Networks of Mates Rip Off Everyday Australians. Okay. And it's revised and updated. But yeah, the emails keep coming with examples. But I think to be clear, it's not really corruption sort of the traditional way we think about it. What I call it in the book is grey corruption or political favoritism, which is really this soft revolving door reciprocation of favours over time. Yeah,
handshakes.
Which is often very legal, right? You know, it's not illegal to lobby. It's not illegal to represent yourself. It's not illegal to finish as premier one day and work for a oil company lobbyist the following day. But these are the mechanisms that sort of end up costing us because this network ends up favouring themselves. So if there's political discretion over how to tax something or how to allocate a grant or how to sign a contract, then when that discretion comes, you favour your mates who you're sharing that revolving door with. And that's the premise of the book.
Is there a sector or industry in which this is like most prevalent?
Look, all large regulated industries, and in Australia that's quite a lot, right? Yeah. So we have property, we have mining, when we have banking. Essentially the main sectors of Australia's economy, they're all heavily regulated. They're all reliant on political decisions about mining rights, royalty regimes, regulating credit in the banking sector, zoning, planning, taxation of property. So, you know, Australia doesn't have as broad an economy as places like Germany or the United States or China or even Canada.
When you say broad, what do you mean exactly?
Broad as in lots of different sectors. So, for example, if there are measures of this, like one of them is called the Index of Economic Complexity, and it basically measures how many different types of products does your country export. Okay. And so you'll have a country like Dubai, Saudi Arabia, where it's 90% oil. You'll have a country like Australia, where it's 50% coal and iron ore, and then a bunch of other minerals and agricultural products. Right. And then you'll have a country like Germany, which is like 20%, medical machines, 20%, intermediate manufacturing, robotic things, and 10% this, and a whole mix of things. And not only is there a broad range, the things they export don't get made in many countries, so they're also difficult to do. Whereas Australia exports very basic things. Okay. Yeah. So this is sort of a big picture of where Australia is.
You're reminding me that I need to play Tradle today. I haven't played it.
Exactly. Well, I think Tradle actually evolved out of these guys at Harvard. Ricardo Hausmann and Cesar Hidalgo started this Index of Economic Complexity, mapping the export composition. Okay. And for the last 20 years. And now they've got this online internet game that rivals Wordle.
Yeah. Do you play it? You'd be so good at it. I wouldn't want to verse you.
From time to time, but I use a lot of those examples in my classes when we talk about exports and global trade.
It's interesting. So what you're saying is Australia is we're less diversified.
Correct. And in the rankings of diversity, for example, Australia used to be, I'm going to just make up some numbers. Okay. There's 150 countries that are in this measure, and Australia used to be 30, and now we're 90.
In terms of the
metric of how diverse our export basket is of the different types of things.
So we've become less diverse.
Because we don't make cars and export them anymore, for example. But we do a lot more of the same things. So we do a lot more coal and iron ore.
Are a lot of countries moving that way? They're becoming less diversified with time, or is it just an Australian thing?
No. So, a lot of Asian countries are getting more diverse. The top the top 5 are usually Switzerland, Germany, the United States, China, that sort of thing, and they're pretty comfortably at the top. But Australia's a little bit unique just because of our small size and the relative size of our resources.
Yeah.
And the question is, do we want to change policy to get a different outcome? So, in the United States at the moment, they have that the subsidies for what do they call it? Rehoming manufacturing, bringing manufacturing back. So they've got record manufacturing construction there. The question is, do we want to do that? Is that going to be full of favours to selected groups? Does it matter if it's full of favours because it'll be worth it collectively in the end?
Does it pay off? Yeah.
These are the questions. This is the sort of broad picture of Australia's economy, yeah.
So if we were to do more of that, would it be in the automotive industry? Like, what industries do you think would have a chance at coming back?
Yeah, it's very, very tricky. It's look at any country trying to develop, right? Look at the Asian targets, so South Korea, Taiwan. It's hard to go from basic industries to a broad range of advanced industries. It's hard to start launching satellites and making aeroplanes if you can't make cars. Yeah. Right? So, and the history of Australia after the Second World War was we'd make horse carriages. So Holden used to make the carriages for the horses. And then we had, protectionist economic policy. So all the American car makers had a certain quota. They could bring in 2,000 cars a month or whatever the number was. And after that, they could only bring parts. And so they would bring in some cars and then they'd send the parts to Holden and they would make horse carriages and then they'd assemble the sort of parts of the American cars. And then over time they did more and more of that and then made more and more components. And then we had a car industry for, many decades. So it's difficult. I think that's a conversation we're not having. Yeah. For sure. We're kind of all in on free markets. We're good at farming and digging and selling houses to each other. Let's just do that. It's working fine, but, it's a conversation we could probably have.
Well, I've seen you tweeting a bit about nuclear energy.
Oh, lately, yeah.
Getting straight into it. Do you think in terms of, the economics of it, is that an industry that has a future here perhaps?
Yeah, look, I think that's one of those types of areas where, you probably need some subsidies to do it the first few times, like any new industry. But it's a big, complicated thing that needs a lot of different experts and specialties and associated industries. And so not only for the long-term reliable energy, and that's, another debate about the investment we're making. And, I hosted Aidan Morrison on my Substack talking about that, that just the cost of having an electricity network with variable generation from renewables is so high compared to stable generation like gas, coal or nuclear. So it's definitely a pathway for a more reliable low-cost grid and B, a pathway to diversifying manufacturing and people who want, for example, high-speed rail and things like that, like, really economy-changing investments, you're going to need a lot of just electricity, cheap, reliable, constant, running your high-speed rail. It's so, I see lots of opportunities there. And my impression is the debate has shifted a lot in the last couple of years.
Definitely.
Not just in Australia, but globally. I think the 2030s, it's going to be a nuclear renaissance. I think the next 4 or 5 years, a lot of countries are going to cut deals and all your major, Korean, Canadian, American nuclear businesses are going to be just booming.
So in our part of the world, in the Asia Pacific, as you mentioned, Korea uses nuclear energy, Japan,
China, India now
as
Dubai's just opened its first, near Abu Dhabi in the UAE, they've just opened a reactor that was built by the Koreans.
Right.
And they signed that contract 14 years ago. They got 4 reactors running.
Right. So perhaps we'd need Korean help as well with our first few, because
it's always going to be like that. We're not going to just put an ad on seek.com and someone's going to go, you're the boss, you're in charge of nuclear. It'll be a bunch of Americans, Canadians, Koreans, people who've built their career on it, and this is the same thing when China grows, right? China's car industry, one of the original deals was getting Audi to make engines in China, for example. And so all the German experts went there and trained up and nurtured that ecosystem of local talent. We'd have to do the same thing.
So what resistance, if any, would there be from other energy industries in Australia?
That's heaps.
Yeah. Do you think that's part of the reason why the moratorium is
still there?
Still there, or is that getting a bit conspiratorial on my part?
Yeah, I think so. I think there is power in electoral momentum. So when the people have shifted and changed their mind, the political party that promises that will get, it becomes worth it. So I think there is a feedback mechanism there. And what you see in the surveys, not just in Australia but globally, is everyone under 40 just wants nuclear energy.
Yeah.
So I think we're aging out of the fear of nuclear energy. And, I think that's happening in the next decade in terms of the electoral balance. So I think that's what's going to change it. Now, you're right that there's a lot of interest groups in solar, people signing deals with big wind farms who require certain transmission investments to make that viable. That's okay. I don't mind having too much energy, right? Nuclear is going to take a while. So it's not like the delivery of electricity is going to undercut prices today. So people are going to make money on their investments currently. But yeah, there probably is a little pushback, but probably those organisations will get involved. If they're already in energy and transmission, they might get involved anyway if nuclear is part of the mix.
What else do you see in the future of Australia for people my age who are going to be having kids soon, and like what will my kids, and I know you're not like a soothsayer or anything, but
let me just
well, I think I asked you one time on Twitter, like, is it true that my generation is worse off economically or financially? It feels like that.
Look, that's a tricky question. Honestly, it's very hard to compare to 40 years ago, just because the amount of options you have in your life has radically changed. The amount of ability to travel and work abroad, now work from home and different variations on the theme are so much higher. The big issue seems to be about housing, right? The generational gap in housing. So when the boomers were growing up, we were still sort of collectively of the view that government should make sure people get houses. And some people argue that sort of backfired because it created this home owning class that wanted their biggest asset to keep going up in value. And so I think that's the real trick.
So you would tend to agree with that?
Yeah, so I've got a little bit more of a subtle view. It's not that the market for rent or housing is abnormal. So I've got a book coming out next year called The Great Housing Hijack, which is actually about, what's going on in the housing policy debate and why do we feel like this, right? Shouldn't things be getting better and easier all the time? And with housing, it seemed like we stopped. Why?
Backwards,
And the answer is not that the market is doing anything different. I think the answer is that we are not intervening or offering public alternatives like we used to. So we don't have the Commonwealth Housing support schemes we used to have that funded tens of thousands of new dwellings for home buyers for 25 years. We got home ownership up from pre-World War II. It was below 50% in the urban areas, and it got up to 71.5% by 1970.
Wow.
So those post-war decades saw radical change. And so the baby boomers grew up during that, right? So they started buying houses in the 70s and 80s. And so they sort of got the tail end of it. And then in the 80s, we sort of changed our mind and said, governments don't do things anymore. Governments just regulate things. Why would we build houses for people? Why would we subsidise that? Why would we own the telephone network? That's just silly.
So more laissez-faire sort of stuff.
And so we just get... It's not like there weren't market outcomes, but now it's harder to escape the market outcomes. So if you, for example, let's just say you're a teacher. So my parents were teachers.
Both my parents are teachers.
They got free university because there was a shortage of teachers. And then they got shipped around and they had a really good middle-class life as a teacher. Very tricky as a teacher today to do what my parents did. Now, that's partly the housing market maybe in many areas, but it's partly just the reordering of what sort of jobs make what as well. So I think our expectation of what sort of career is middle class is different. So you might, I know people who make more money as plumbers and electricians than as academics. So previously it might have been, well, you study hard, you do this, you get your middle class career. But we've got this sort of different, and I don't know if it's good or bad. I think it's great that Australian tradies make a good living.
But that's an Aussie thing, right? Because I know when I was living in Spain, like the tradies there don't live like the tradies here, for example.
No, it's kind of Australia, Canada, North American Australia. Probably Australia's the more extreme in terms of like the hourly rate that you make.
How do we explain that? Why did it shift like that?
So, think about the push to get everyone through university, right? So I think we've sort of engineered policy to sort of flood the market with managers or academics or whatever, and sort of pretended that these trades aren't, super important to a modern economy.
Right.
And now, that's good if you're making money there, but I don't know if that's great as a society. I don't know what's right or wrong. But it could be a lot to do with that. I had a guy I knew, was selling IT software, and after the financial crisis went and poured concrete because it made more money, right? Which is great if you're pouring concrete. It's not an easy job. He didn't last that long. But it is, I think, the way we think about the hierarchy of jobs and go, oh, look, it's harder for me today. Well, is it? Maybe if you're an electrician, it's not harder today. Maybe it's easier to have a good business.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
So I just don't know. Because at the end of
definitely not the best time to be like a humanities-brained girl who loves to just like study philosophy at uni.
Yeah. Well, we're not. See, and the university's the same, right? So if you're going to get half the people through university instead of 15%, well, you used to take the top 15. So all those types of careers were really scarce or valuable, and now you just can pick from anyone who's got these degrees. Or whatever. So, look, I don't know how much of it that is. A good side of that is you can just go to university and do whatever you want. Like, there's a lot of additional choice there as well. So it's just so hard to tell, and I think we get swept up in this, it was easier for my parents. It was easier for some parents, maybe the teachers. I don't think I would want to be a teacher. I see a lot of ads for economics teachers, and I thought, I think I'd be all right at that. And then I look what they're paying, and I'm like, I'm not going to I'm not going to look after 30 teenagers who don't want to learn economics and deal with the administration, the marking, the behaviour when I've got better options, right? So definitely I can see in certain key areas there's some issues.
And when it comes to home ownership, is there an argument that it's not a good metric to care about? Like, does it really matter that lots of people own their own homes or not?
Well, that's a good question. Depends what they're paying to rent, I guess, doesn't it? So if you look at countries where renters are well protected from rapidly rising rents and have a lot of security and rights, if you go to Switzerland or Germany or Austria, half the people live in rented houses. This is a wealthy country. These are very wealthy countries, which you would expect to be able to have high home ownership, but because the gains aren't worth it for people because the security of renting is so strong. There's social renting options, even the private market you get protected quite well. People can live in the same house for 30 years. Then there's less incentive to become a homeowner. So I don't think one is good or bad, but if you want to have a private rental market that's very hands-off, rents go 10%, go and kick your tenants out and reshuffle people around, then home ownership is a good objective because people get insulated from that. And I often say home ownership is the ultimate rent control, right? Because your landlord doesn't put the rent up on you ever.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's almost like that's one way to escape the variability and the unexpected changes in rent. So if I'm a teacher, I've got a very stable income in my career. And if the rents in my neighbourhood or my part of if the rents go up quickly because there's a big change to the composition of people, well, I can't, I've got this career job. My income's not keeping up with yours to outbid you for rents. what am I supposed to do? I'll get reshuffled around. I'll get kicked out. Whereas if I own the home, that can happen and I can stay there.
So obviously renting, changes from state to state here, but in general in Australia, are we one of the most like hands-off nations when it comes to rent control, would you say?
If you compare us to Europe, that's the case.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, North America is pretty relaxed about
and have
that.
we become more Americanized in terms of renting over time?
No, it's been pretty, like if anything, standards are improving.
Okay.
If you look at a multi-decade period, we require smoke detectors now. We require lockable windows. And, I think there was a hilarious new minimum rental standard. I don't know if it was Queensland or Victoria. It said you must have a door on the toilet. You can't, your room with the toilet must have a door.
Interesting.
And I'm like, wow, it's 2023. I'm glad we've got that standard now. But, it's kind of, I think sometimes it's very hard to compare.
Yeah.
So I think, the average house is bigger and better than it ever was. We complain about how dodgy Australian houses
Let me complain, Cam, please.
But I'll give you an interesting example, right? So
let me be sad. No.
If you go to like the slum reviews of Victoria in the 1930s. Slum reviews. There were so many slums in the cities and everyone was sick all the time.
Really?
People, there was no sewers or fresh water, so there was just...
Oh, in Victoria or Victorian times?
No, in Victoria in the 1930s.
Really? Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, Victoria, Australia, in Melbourne, right? And a lot of the modern rules around, at that time, there was no such thing as a rental tenants agency. Like rents were just contracts between two people. And there were no requirements on it. And, the slum review guys said, people cannot store food in their home because there's so many rats running around, because there's so many horse stables and just, people are keeping animals and horses everywhere. And so people couldn't keep food and they'd hang food from strings from the roof and try and, so rats couldn't get to it with little traps and mechanisms. And all the kids were sick all the time. And so, it's nice to appreciate the positives, but I think because the change the boomers experienced was so radical and so positive for so many decades, when we don't see improvement, we're like, hey.
Yeah.
We've been treading water for 30 years.
So I've been thinking about this a lot. I don't understand economics very well, but surely things can't just get better and better and better, and right? Like there's got to be booms and busts. And
I think things can get better and better. I think just our ability to reorganize more efficiently, to use new knowledge we acquire that we needed the last, we couldn't have got nuclear power in the 1800s, but we could have got it in the 1900s because we had all that previous industrial investment. So we could refine certain materials. And I think that happens now, the changes with IT. So I think, we can get better. I like to be optimistic over the long run, but I don't think it's a beautiful exponential curve.
Yeah.
This is one thing economists, I think, often forget is they celebrate the long run growth and this is all the great stuff and forget that almost without fail economies go in boom and bust cycles. And that's why we use monetary policy and fiscal policy to try and smooth that out. So we kind of know it, but we kind of forget quite often. So I expect there'll be corrections in the next, by the end of the decade. I don't know exactly when.
And on Twitter, you've got in your bio independent thinker, which I like, which is maybe why we have some connection with Quillette. But if you had to put yourself in a box, like what type of economic philosophies do you sort of fit more in line with your thinking?
It's funny because I wrote an article on the Substack, Fresh Economic Thinking, right? So I wrote one that said, what's my economic religion or something? Because I do feel like a lot of the time people find something they can relate to and then they just push that. Like it's like, oh, this is my God now. I'm going to worship this. I feel that sometimes where I'm like, but guys, this is really good. This helps explain things. I feel that. But I think in the last decade or so since my PhD, and I credit Paul Fried as my PhD supervisor for just sort of beating out of me this unrigorous thinking. I think now I can see the insights in lots of different areas. and balance them up a little without having to say, Keynes was right or, Hayek was right about innovation markets. I'm like, yeah, well, of course there's an element of truth there. He didn't invent that from not observing the world. That was his attempt at understanding the world. And Keynes had his insights into the sort of public sector mechanism as well and the treasury. That was his thing. And there's going to be both, and you've got to sort of, there's an art form, I think, over time of learning to contextualize that. So online I get called, during COVID I was saying, it's probably not a good idea to lock people down because, that's the thing we do every day when we go out and we meet people and we socialize and we work. That's exactly what makes us rich and makes us live a long time because, rich places live a long time. If we stop doing the things every day that make us rich, we won't be rich, and all these unintended side effects will occur. So I got called, the grandma killing libertarian or whatever. Yeah. But then when I say, the public hospital system works quite well and we should reduce subsidies to private insurers because they're not adding a lot of value, or the government should just build houses for people because, everyone loves investing in housing except the public, except the government. We all think we're going to make a fortune. The government says, no, it's too expensive. Blows my mind. So then they call me a raving communist, lefty, whatever.
That's cool. So, you can't be placed. You can't be pinned.
And I think, I have friends from all across the spectrum, and I think most Aussies are a bit like that. If you really ask them, what do you think?
Yeah. We're not as polarized, in terms of like libertarian economics or we tend to be quite centrist from what I understand. Even I know like Keating really changed a lot of Australia's economy, but still it was quite...
Yeah, it didn't go too crazy. Yeah.
Maybe that's why we live so well here.
It's one of those mysteries about Australia, how things function very well. You can complain about the bureaucracy and you can complain about town planning. I research property and housing, so I hear that all the time. But then you've just got to go to a country that doesn't function well and you just... your jaw drops. Like, I'm complaining about bureaucracy that takes 10 minutes. These guys will send it to me in a month, maybe, right?
Yeah, but that's why I think books like yours, like Game of Mates or Rigged, is so important because we do have it good. It's great, but we need to keep on top of it. We need to prune, and it's people like you who prune it, so that's good.
I think you're totally right. And so I've been thinking a lot more about this pruning idea that you've just brought up on a broad sense. So, for example, economists don't like monopolies, right? It's not. To be honest, it's not exactly clear why, because monopolies are responsive to prices and they vary their output. I think the true concern about monopoly is that you can't prune the monopoly, right? So the competitor is what comes in and prunes them, forces them to update stuff. And it's very hard to change large organizations as well. And so, even if your monopolist has the best of intentions, just turning that ship is too hard. So competition can do that by starting a new organization of human beings cooperating for an outcome, whether it's in business or politics, and we can just get rid of that one and replace it with the better one. Right, so there's this pruning process that competition does in the economy, and one of the things I've been really thinking more about is how to do that in the public sector, whether it's in health, education, infrastructure, any of the bureaucracies. Well, can you start a competitor organisation with similar responsibilities and let it compete with the existing one? And after 2 years, whoever can do a better job keeps the job, right? So you can almost sort of build in that pruning process.
Like,
I don't know, it's very difficult.
Like generate competition just internally. For that reason.
Yeah. So, look, there's probably circumstances where we don't want it. We don't want schools to go broke and then close them down because there's a whole bunch of families relying on it. But there might be elements around that. And we incorporate that when we do tenders for construction project and whatever. We make sure there's new people coming in and tendering and seeing if they can do a better job. And so we do incorporate it to a degree. And I do wonder if there's more ways we can do that just to make sure we're staying on top of it. Because I do think countries go in cycles of deteriorating ability, quality of public sector management particularly. and then a reinvigoration. And the question is, how can we avoid getting too bad before we improve by having something like that?
Do you have any info on the salaries of public service workers? Because they do seem to have, from what I can see, shot through the roof.
Australians are reasonably well paid. It sort of depends on levels and areas, and So if you're the head of who was the recent person who got kicked out of their $900,000 a year job? So I don't mind paying people, good money. The trick is building in this accountability and this pruning, and not letting them sit there for 8 years getting $1 million a year and not delivering. And so I think it's fine to do that if they're accountable. And that's why in business there's a little bit more of, we'll pay them, but if it goes bad, we're going to pay you in some equity as well. So so we could incorporate that more. To be honest, there's a lot of trial and error in getting these systems in place, and I think we have to accept that as well. I can't just say, this is my solution, it's going to work. I'm a real fan of piloting. Okay, in this new area, we're going to trial this in the education sector, health or whatever, in the town planning. We're going to trial this for 2 years.
And we can copy what other countries have done, right? Like,
exactly.
You were the first person to introduce me to the Singaporean system of Singapore is such an interesting country in general, but their housing. Could you explain a little bit about that?
So Singapore is an interesting country because if you go to organisations like the Heritage Foundation, who do these indexes of liberty or for indexes of economic freedom, they'll put Singapore really high up. And I'll be like, but Singapore is really, really strict with its social rules and crime, rules about crime. But also it's got this massive public sector housing provider that's built 80% of all the houses in the country, or the dwellings. They're all apartments. And so it's again, maybe I relate because I feel like I like the best of both worlds when it comes to economic principles. But the Singapore system is essentially a public option. So it's like a public school or a public hospital. Any resident who's over 21 can apply as a couple to purchase from the housing.
No singles?
Singles have to wait till they're 30-something.
Okay.
Which again,
encouraging people to to pair up.
That's right. So again, index of economic freedom. Hang on, this is very socially engineered. The other thing they have is racial quotas for each housing project because when Singapore became independent in 1965, there's a lot of tension between the Malays, the Indians, the Chinese, etc. So there's a bit of a social engineering aspect. But essentially, they have a public option. So if I wanted to buy an apartment, I could go to the private sector and buy whatever they're selling, or I could put an application in to buy off the plan from the HDB, or I could buy in the secondary market, it's not on Gumtree, it's through real estate agents, but a second-hand one from a seller of a housing development board apartment. And we would do our own contract for that. But the trick there is that the only person who can buy one of those HDB is a resident who qualifies. And all those residents have the option of the discounted new one as well. So that anchors the price. And so I interviewed a young couple there who just moved into their HDB apartment, and they paid something like 350,000 Singapore dollars, which is about 350,000 Aussie. And they said they waited 2 years, so that's about the normal. So if you buy off the plan, very similar to here. And they said if they bought in the private market, it'd be nearly $1 million Singapore dollars.
And there's enough.
If you could even buy something similar, which you can't because it's very differentiated, because everyone just gets HDB.
Right. So, and all the HDB.
Housing Development Board,
And they're all pretty much the same sort of dwelling. There's not
No. So you can go from studios to 5-bedroom executive suites, and they have multi-generational. So there's part of this social engineering is encouraging kids to look after their parents. So if you apply, for example, for an off-the-plan apartment with a granny flat room, you'll get if there's a queue for that project, you'll get ahead of the queue because you're bringing in your parent and looking after them.
So interesting.
So
it seems like you're quite a fan.
I think the principle is basically the key here. The principle of having this public alternative at a discount in a parallel system that you can trade, and where it's home ownership and the person who buys it can paint the walls whatever colour, change the carpet. In fact, you can buy off the plan, like empty. So you do your own kitchen, door handles, light fittings, etc. I think that fits culturally, right? So if we want to have non-market options, public rental targeted at the lowest income has a lot of issues. Universal home ownership with options at all different income levels in every city, I think, is how you want to do it.
Sounds great.
A little bit like schools and hospitals, right? We put them everywhere. Everyone's got the option.
Are any politicians considering this? Is it even...
So the most interest, I'm talking to people in lots of states and the federal government. There's interest in Canberra of piloting a similar thing for teachers and nurses. In Canberra, people don't realise, but all the new housing subdivisions are actually done by the territory government. They do all the new estates and subdivisions. So they could easily just allocate through a different sort of ownership structure these dwellings to pilot it for nurses, whoever they want, right?
So there's no private development?
You can redevelop privately.
Okay.
So existing housing lots that you might put townhouses or apartments on, and in the city centre redeveloping, that's all privately done, but all the conversion of non-urban to urban use is done by the territory government. They make hundreds of millions of dollars a year in profit doing it.
And so it's good for the residents?
It's almost indistinguishable, right? They could have a signed Lend-Lease Stockland or one of the other big guys out the front, but they don't. It says the Suburban Land Agency. So they essentially operate in the same way. But, they pay less tax there because the government's making the gains on real estate.
Okay. Sydney seems to be like one of the worst cities for renting. And, I'm just talking out of my butt here, but just looking at the geography, I've just moved to the east and it's like there's no mall. Like you're on the edge of the ocean, like how much... without building up, people have to go sprawl out, right?
Yeah, well, most cities do both all the time. Sydney's actually one of the more dense in terms of the proportion of attached dwellings being developed.
Attached dwellings?
Like townhouses and apartments.
Okay.
Yeah, Sydney's one of the more dense and it's doing more attached housing redevelopment than anywhere else. And, people are good at substituting, right? If you can't do lots more detached or if it's, in a low value area... people will substitute and buy the new townhouses elsewhere and pay for the location instead of the backyard. That happens. But I think it's interesting that you jump to the physical layout of Sydney when you said Sydney's expensive. And I think this happens in housing a lot. We have an economic issue about the pricing of housing and we think it must have something to do with the physical shape of the houses. Whether they're stacked up or next to each other or they're pink or blue or green. But I think the economics really explains the pricing. It's essentially Sydney's full of rich people. That is why it's expensive. If Sydney was full of poor people, it would be very cheap.
Is it true that...
There's my short answer to pricing.
Well, that's interesting. And it's not just that they live here, right? It's that a lot of rich people who don't live in Sydney own property in Sydney. Yeah,
that's true. Correct? But of course they can buy property anywhere they want and... Sydney's got to outcompete buying expensive riverfront property in Brisbane or, anywhere else in the world. So there are limits to how expensive it can be because every $1 million you waste in Sydney could buy you, 2 apartments in Brisbane. And so it can't, it can't just do its own thing. There's an economic relationship.
But do you think there should be a limit on how many investment properties someone can...
Well, yeah, that's a good question. So funny thing in speaking of Singapore, so their concern was this small slither of households, 10% who aren't HDB, are being bought by foreigners. And so they increased the stamp duty, so the payment that you pay the government when you purchase a property. That stamp duty for foreign buyers ranges between 30 and 60% of the price.
Wow. What's stamp duty here?
Stamp duty here is between 3 and 5.5%.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So 10
30
times...
and 60?
Yeah, 30. So you got to pay, 50% more. So your $1 million place is going to... $1 million to the seller and 1.5 to the Singapore government. So yeah, that's what they did. But I guess I'm not super... concerned. I think, yes, there's some price effect, but if the yield falls, so, you pay $1 million, you're only getting $10,000 a year in net rent, let's just say. If I'm a foreigner, there's still lots of other places for me to put $1 million and make more than $10,000 a year, maybe with less risk. So, one of the reasons that foreign buying can increase prices is because there is an additional non-monetary payoff to this type of asset compared to all the other investment alternatives. So you might go, you're only getting a 1% yield in Sydney buying this premium property. Capital gains, we're not sure, it's very risky. But there is a huge gain from having an Australian asset rather than a Chinese or, Malaysian or whatever asset, or Indian. There's an non-monetary value there, so you pay a premium price for that. So that can be a thing. But in the 2010s, when there was a lot of foreign buying, it probably had a bit of a price effect for that reason, right? So we had a lot of foreign buying, a lot of apartment boom construction. And then during COVID, we just lowered interest rates anyways to get the prices up. So I'm like, well, we all panicked about high prices because maybe we thought there were foreign buyers who would accept a lower yield. Then we just reduced the interest rate to lower everyone's yields. So everyone can now pay the higher prices. Is that better or worse? I don't know. That's another funny thing in housing is when prices go down, we panic. We've got to lower interest rates, can't have a housing crash. Prices go up, we panic. Oh no, people can't afford houses. We have to pick one, right? And so that's again why I think this parallel alternative. If prices are going up, going down, people can at least go, oh, that's risky. I'm going to, buy something off the plan from the public housing company or buy a secondhand one in a neighbourhood. And just I'm not going to deal with timing the market and all of that. So anyway, that's my big picture view on those things.
Okay. I'm thinking a lot. I'm not sure if this is in your ballpark, but I'll see. I've been thinking a lot about people who live in remote communities and how there's obvious disadvantage there. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on whether that's just inevitable, that the further you live from these cities, these sort of economic hubs, if there's anything to be done or said for living remotely.
As in the problems of getting houses built in Indigenous communities, or the cost of just living and getting your groceries. That's a huge issue.
Everything, I suppose. Healthcare, job opportunities. Australia is such a massive nation. Is it just that we have to live in cities if we want to? No,
look, we started in cities and we sort of moved out and farmed the land. But as we get better at farming, there's less people need to live there because we can drive out there faster. We can use more machines, so people can live in the city, and then at harvest time they can just drive out. Everyone convenes, does what they need, and go back. So I think that's just a product of what we call agglomeration effects. There's more options when we all live near each other, and when we don't have to, because we can use machines and drive fast and fly around, we don't. So look at mining, all right? Mining towns used to have lots of people because of the mine. Now it's got no one because we just fly in. So, I think, that's happening all around the world. People like living near each other, and there are efficiencies from it. So, it's an economic force that is hard to combat unless there is a real important reason to be at a location, like a mine or a natural resource or... Yeah.
And another question. I remember a tweet, I think it was a poll, a question you'd asked, is there an ideal amount of immigration to Australia, immigration rate? I'd love to chat to you a bit about, your thoughts on immigration and how it affects...
Yeah, well, I'll try and quickly summarise. Immigration is good. The question is how quickly you do it, because the economy adjusts at a certain rate. We build houses at a certain rate. We invest in capital in roads and schools and whatnot. And because those investments are such a huge share of the economy, so investments are a third of the economy, just building buildings and houses and roads and stuff. So there's a big difference if you're growing at 0.5%, 1.5%, or 3%. I guess my general rule of thumb is if you're growing at 1% or less, it's very manageable. If you're growing at 2% or more, then that adjustment is going to have flow-on effects through housing, through the inability to catch up with certain things.
Do you know what Australia's growing at?
It's about bit over 2. So Canada right now is 3, which is like world record. I think it's a bit temporary this year. There's a bit of catch-up growth of students and stuff. I think in my ideal world, it's closer to 1.
Does that include people on temporary visas, like student visas and stuff?
Yeah.
How do they count
so
that?
it's you've got to reside 12 out of 16 months in the country, and then you
Okay.
count it as being
A resident.
in the resident population. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's how it works. So I think it's a funny debate because again, it's a polarizing one. Some people want to, one in, one out, close the border. And, I was the only person in COVID saying don't close the border, right? One of the few people. And now apparently, no, open the border, fully open. I'm like, come on, guys. Can we just be reasonable about this? And I think there's some perverse effects in education as well when universities just want to select everyone. I've taught master's classes that are almost all foreign students because master's degrees get you more points for various parts of the visa system. The top third is amazing, come from the central banks of treasuries of big companies around the world, and the rest will tell me, I'm here for points for my visa. I've already studied this topic. I hope I can do it because my English is bad because I already studied it. So there's a few perverse outcomes, and I think just, managing the rate solves a lot of those things.
Is there anything else you'd like to
No, that was a fun
today?
chat. I'm sure we'll have to talk again. And
So your
more.
book, Rigged, is available?
Rigged's available everywhere.
Okay.
And The Great Housing Hijack will be out at the end of February next year.
Great. Looking forward to it. Okay. Thanks for coming and talking to me.
Thanks, Zoe.
Yeah. Bye.